Moving into a new house was supposed to be the fresh start we needed. After years of saving, my wife Emily and I finally found the perfect place, a charming, old Victorian home nestled at the edge of a quiet town. It was the kind of house that felt timeless, with its wraparound porch, ornate gables, and ivy creeping up the walls. The price was a steal, almost too good to be true, but we were assured by the real estate agent that it was simply due to the property being on the market for so long. People in town, she explained, preferred newer builds with modern amenities. We moved in on a crisp autumn day, the kind where the leaves crunched underfoot and the air smelled of wood smoke. Our 2 young children, Sarah and Ben, were thrilled with the new place, immediately claiming their rooms and exploring every nook and cranny. The house felt lived in, comfortable even, but there was an undeniable chill in the air that seemed to linger, no matter how high we cranked the thermostat. The first few nights were uneventful. We spent our time unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting used to the creaks and groans of the old house. It wasn't until the 3rd night that I began to notice things that I couldn't explain. It started with small, almost imperceptible things, a draft where there shouldn't have been one, doors that I was sure I had closed were left ajar, and the feeling that I was being watched. Emily shrugged it off, blaming it on the quirks of an old house settling. I wanted to believe her, but something deep inside me whispered that this was different. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I decided to explore the basement. We hadn't spent much time down there since moving in, and I figured it would be good to see what kind of storage space we had. The basement door was in the kitchen, a heavy wooden thing that stuck in its frame when I tried to open it. With a hard shove, it finally gave way, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb must have blown, I thought, cursing under my breath as I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight. The air grew colder as I descended the steps, and the scent of damp earth and mildew filled my nostrils. The light from my phone was weak, barely illuminating the space, but I could make out the rough stone walls and the uneven dirt floor. At the far end of the basement, something caught my eye, a door. It was small, almost child-sized, and made of heavy iron, with intricate designs etched into its surface. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted handle. There was no reason for a door like this to be in an old Victorian home, and the more I looked at it, the more an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. I shook my head, telling myself I was being ridiculous, and pulled the door open. It groaned on its hinges, revealing a narrow passageway that stretched into the darkness. The walls were lined with what looked like old, rotting wood, and the floor was slick with moisture. A shiver ran down my spine, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The passageway twisted and turned, and I quickly lost track of how far I had gone. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of decay became overpowering. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as a sense of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. I stopped, straining to hear, but the sound had already faded. My heart pounded in my chest as I continued down the passage, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I had the overwhelming urge to turn back, but something compelled me to keep going. As I rounded a corner, I saw it, a small, flickering light at the end of the passage. Relief washed over me, thinking I had finally found the end, but as I got closer, I realized the light was coming from a single, burning candle set on the floor. The flame danced and flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then I saw her. She was standing just beyond the candlelight, her back turned to me. Her long, Dark hair hung in tangled strands down her back, and her clothes were tattered and stained. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel her presence, heavy and oppressive, filling the space. "Emily?" I whispered, though I knew it wasn't her. My voice echoed off the walls, sounding small and insignificant. The figure didn't respond, didn't acknowledge me at all. I took a cautious step forward, and as I did, she began to turn, slowly, deliberately, until her face came into view. I wish I could say I screamed, that I turned and ran, but I was frozen in place, my legs refusing to obey. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light around them. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over her bones, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that sent a wave of nausea crashing over me. She took a step toward me, and I finally found the strength to move. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I turned and ran. The passageway seemed to stretch on forever, but I didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down until I was back in the basement, slamming the iron door shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The house was silent, the only sound the blood rushing in my ears. I knew I couldn't tell Emily, couldn't tell anyone, they would think I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. But the thing in the passageway, it was real. I knew that much. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump, my mind conjuring images of the woman in the passage. I kept the lights on, my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind. I focused on getting the house in order, on being there for my kids, but the memory of that face haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that at any moment, I would turn around and she would be there, smiling that awful smile. It wasn't long before other things started happening. Small at first, objects moving on their own, cold spots in the house, the kids waking up in the middle of the night, crying about a bad lady in their room. Emily tried to reassure them, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at the basement door. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps creaking down the hallway outside our bedroom. I held my breath, listening, as the footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped just outside the door, and I heard a soft tapping, like fingernails lightly scratching the wood. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the scratching, growing more insistent. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, my hands shaking so badly I nearly knocked it over. The light flicked on, casting long shadows across the room. "Please, stop," I whispered, though I didn't know who or what I was pleading with. The scratching ceased abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I watched, helpless, as the door creaked open. But there was no one there. I sat frozen in place, staring at the empty doorway. The air was thick with tension, the silence deafening. I could feel something, someone, standing just out of sight, watching me, waiting. "Get out," I managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, and I let out a strangled cry, my body shaking with fear. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, too afraid to close my eyes, too afraid of what I might see if I did. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly oppressive. The kids refused to sleep in their rooms, insisting that the bad lady was watching them. Emily became withdrawn, her eyes constantly darting toward the basement door. She asked me if I had seen anything strange, if I had heard the noises, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I didn't want to admit it, even to myself, but I knew we had to leave. Something was wrong with this house, something beyond our understanding, and the longer we stayed, the worse it became. But every time I tried to bring it up, something would happen. The lights would flicker, a door would slam, and I would lose my nerve. Then, one evening, as we sat down to dinner, the lights in the dining room began to dim, slowly at first, then flickering wildly before going out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and I heard the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as the kids jumped up, screaming. "Daddy, she's here!" Sarah cried, her voice high-pitched and panicked. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak light to illuminate the room. The kids were huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. Emily was standing, her face pale, her eyes locked on something behind me. I turned slowly, the light from my phone casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. And there, standing in the corner of the room, was the woman from the basement. She was closer now, her hollow eyes fixed on me, her twisted grin wider than before. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The kids were crying, Emily was trembling, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. She took a step forward, and the lights flickered back on, blindingly bright. I blinked, and she was gone. The room was silent, save for the sound of the kids' sobs. I knew then that we couldn't stay here, that we had to leave, but as I looked around the room, I felt the weight of something watching us, something that wasn't going to let us go so easily. And that's when I heard it, a soft, whispered laugh, echoing from the basement. I knew we were out of time. The days that followed were a blur of terror and tension. I hardly slept, hardly ate, and I could see the toll it was taking on Emily and the kids. The house seemed alive, its walls pulsing with a malevolent energy that grew stronger with each passing hour. I could feel it, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The woman in the basement haunted my every waking thought. I saw her in my dreams, in the corners of my vision, even when I closed my eyes. It was like she had burrowed into my mind, leaving a part of her darkness inside me. The kids refused to sleep in their rooms, and Emily had taken to keeping all the lights on, even during the day. The house was never dark, but it was never bright either. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, mocking our feeble attempts at illumination. I knew we had to leave. I told Emily as much, and for once, she didn't argue. We packed what little we could, shoving clothes and essentials into bags, but as we prepared to leave, the house fought back. It started with the doors. We were trying to load the car when the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emily screamed, dropping the bags she was holding. I rushed to the door, pulling on the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had locked us in. "We need to go," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face as she grabbed the kids. I turned to the back door, but the moment I reached for the handle, it too slammed shut. The windows rattled in their frames, and the lights began to flicker violently. "Daddy, what's happening?" Ben whimpered, clinging to Emily's leg. "It's okay, buddy," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're going to get out of here." But I wasn't sure if we would. Every door I tried was either locked or slammed shut before I could open it. The windows were the same, as if some invisible force was controlling them. The house was holding us prisoner. "Try the basement," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I froze. The thought of going back down there made my blood run cold, but it was the only way. If there was another way out, it had to be down there. Stay here, I told Emily, but she shook her head. No, we stay together. I couldn't argue with her. We gathered the kids, their small hands clutching ours as we made our way to the basement door. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked like the others, but to my surprise, it opened easily. The air that wafted up from the basement was even colder than before, carrying with it that same sickly, decaying smell. The stairs creaked ominously as we descended, the light from our phones casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I could feel the darkness pressing in on us, growing thicker, more oppressive with each step. The basement was just as I had left it, but now the iron door at the far end was slightly ajar, a faint light seeping through the crack. My stomach twisted in fear, but I knew we had no choice. Whatever was down there, we had to face it if we wanted to escape. Stay behind me, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own racing heartbeat. We moved slowly, the kids clutching tightly to us as we approached the door. The closer we got, the stronger the smell became, until it was almost unbearable. The light flickered weakly, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to dance and writhe on the walls. As we reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cold iron. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find another way, but there was no other way. This was it. I pushed the door open, and the light flickered out, plunging us into darkness. Emily gasped, and I could hear the kids whimpering in fear. It's okay, I whispered, though I knew it wasn't. I stepped forward, my foot touching something soft and yielding. I shone my flashlight down and recoiled in horror. The floor was covered in rotting wood, and beneath it, I could see the outlines of something buried, something human-shaped. Before I could process what I was seeing, a cold, clammy hand wrapped around my ankle, sending a jolt of terror through me. I yanked my leg back, stumbling and nearly falling as I pointed the flashlight at the ground. The woman from the basement was crawling toward me, her empty eye sockets fixed on me, her twisted grin wider than ever. Her body was decayed, pieces of flesh hanging from her bones, and she moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, as if her limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. Get back! I shouted, but my voice was weak, barely more than a croak. She ignored me, continuing to crawl forward, her bony fingers reaching out for me. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. The kids were screaming now, and Emily was trying to pull them back, but the basement seemed to close in around us, trapping us in that narrow passage. Please, I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. What do you want? The woman stopped, her head tilting to the side as if she were considering my question. Then, slowly, she pointed to the ground beneath her, to the soft, rotting wood. I shone my flashlight there, and that's when I saw it, a small, rusted key lying in the dirt. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A key? For what? Without thinking, I reached down and picked it up. The moment I did, the woman's grin widened, and she began to dissolve, her body crumbling into a pile of dust and bones. The oppressive cold lifted slightly, but the darkness remained, thick and suffocating. What does it open? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I replied, my mind racing. Then I remembered the small, locked box we had found when we first moved in. It had been tucked away in a corner of the attic, forgotten and covered in dust. We had tried to open it, but the lock was rusted shut, and we didn't have a key. I had almost forgotten about it until now. "We need to go back upstairs," I said, my voice more confident than I felt. We made our way back up the stairs, the house still eerily quiet. The oppressive feeling had lessened, but I could still feel it lurking, waiting for us to make a mistake. I led the way to the attic, Emily and the kids following close behind. The air grew colder as we ascended, and the shadows seemed to deepen, but I pressed on, determined to see this through. The attic was just as we had left it, filled with old, forgotten furniture and boxes of junk. The small, locked box was still there, tucked away in the corner. I knelt down and pulled it out, my hands shaking as I inserted the rusted key into the lock. The key turned with a loud, grinding noise, and the lock clicked open. I hesitated for a moment, then lifted the lid. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed with age, and the writing was faded, but I could still make out the words. It was a diary, written by a woman named Margaret, who had lived in the house over a century ago. As I read, a horrifying story began to unfold. Margaret had been a young mother, living in the house with her husband and 2 children. They had been happy at first, but then strange things began to happen. Her husband became distant, cold, and eventually violent. He claimed to be hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there. He became convinced that the house was cursed, that it was driving him mad. One night, in a fit of rage, he had murdered their children, claiming he was trying to save them from the curse. Margaret had been devastated, but unable to leave the house. She had buried their bodies in the basement, hoping to hide the truth, but the house wouldn't let her forget. The voices continued, the shadows grew darker, and eventually, she too succumbed to the madness. The last entry in the diary was a plea for forgiveness, a desperate hope that one day, someone would come and free her from the house's grasp. "Is she free now?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," I replied, though I wasn't sure. The oppressive feeling had lifted, but the house still felt wrong, like a wound that had yet to heal. "We need to leave," I said again, and this time, I knew there was nothing holding us back. We gathered what little we had packed and made our way to the front door. I half expected it to be locked, but it opened easily, the cold night air rushing in to meet us. We stepped outside, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The house loomed behind us, dark and foreboding, but it no longer felt like it was watching us. Whatever hold it had over us was gone, but I knew we could never come back. We got into the car, and as we drove away, I looked back one last time. In the upstairs window, I thought I saw a shadow, a figure standing there, watching us go. But when I blinked, it was gone.